on record to the cloud. All right. Ben Goff is here with WVU Extension Service. Going to cover crops today for our Grow Appalachia workshop. This is our 5th or 6th workshop. I've lost count. And so Ben, we're going to go ahead and introduce you. And if you'd like to say a few words before you get started with your presentation, let us know a little bit about you and where you're located and all that good stuff. And I'll turn over the meeting to you.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thanks, Lisa, for inviting me. Wish we could be in person, but that's the way things been going this year. So a little bit about background about me. I'm the ag agent in Mason, Putnam counties. Before that, I was a professor at the University of Kentucky. I'm an agronomist by training, so mainly forage livestock. But here in Mason County, we have branched out and done some row crop stuff. And so I asked Lisa, the cover crops. She said, cover crops 099, just, basic entry level cover crops. So I've kind of done that. So if I've, feel free to interject, whatever needs, if you're not clear on anything, or if you have questions about something, you don't necessarily have to wait till the end. I know with Zoom talks, it's always nice to have interaction throughout, or, just make me feel like I'm not talking into a black box. So I've kind of geared it a little bit as much as I could towards gardening, kind of horticulture type settings, but there may be a few cases where I kind of go back talking about field crops, but just realize that the principles kind of transferred across. A lot of the principles we talk about, doesn't matter the scale or the cash crop, it's all the same. So, just to keep people, make sure everybody's on the same page. What are cover crops? My computer, there we go. It's going to work today. Basically a cover crop is any non-cash crop. A cash crop is basically one you're going to take to market, sell, your source of profit. A cover crop is basically anything that's non-cash crop that's grown with that to sustain and improve production. A lot of people call them green manures. That was kind of an older term, vegetative cover, ground vegetation. There's a lot of different things, but basically it's something that we're not actually harvesting for profit. We're doing it mainly to kind of maintain production, or in many cases to actually improve production. And all that is just an alternative. They're leaving just bare soil throughout the winter time, or just leaving plant residues in a lot of agronomic fields. So basically between harvest and planting the next cash crop, I'm just trying to leave that bare. So those what they are, what they aren't, because a lot of times you still get a lot of confusion about crop. They're not crop rotation, which is basically you have 2 cash crops different years, basically the same area of land. One year it's going to be in one cash crop next to the other. Here in Mason County, our biggest crop rotation is one year we'll have corn, next year you'll have soybean. A little bit of variation on that. You compare that to a garden situation. A lot of people kind of use the 4-year rotation: leaf, legume, fruit, root. So you can see lettuce, we rotate with green beans or another type of legume crop with a fruit crop, followed by a potato crop, which isn't a root, but it's still the same thing. That's still a part of good management, don't get me wrong, but that's not necessarily a cover crop. Double cropping, it's not double cropping. Double cropping is using 2 cash crops in the same year. Again, from kind of the traditional field setting, a lot of times some producers have wheat they'll plant in the fall, harvest it in the spring, and follow up with a short season soybean. If you compare that to a gardening situation, double cropping is basically looking at 2 short season crops, cash crops. So a lot of times like a cabbage or, broccoli, an early short season crop, when those are harvested, you can pull them up and then put in a short season, late season crop. Squash, pumpkins, green beans are always good ones. So that's double cropping, not crop rotations. Intercropping, I'll talk a little bit about this towards the end, is basically kind of growing 2 cash crops at the same time in the same year. So like in a more large scale, you can see this field, we have corn and it's rotated with, or these strips are alfalfa. And a lot of time they do that from just a soil standpoint. Most time you see these on banks. There's a lot of intercropping is a lot of variations. That's one. We're actually spacing them out. Again, from the, kind of gardening horticulture base, the three sisters, the corn, beans, and squash, growing those together in a setting. Each one benefits that. The legume provides some nitrogen to the corn. Corn provides a host, a trellis for the beans, and squash provides kind of like the area and kind of weed control and shading of the soil. Companion cropping is not cover crops. Companion cropping is basically planting a crop. Doesn't necessarily matter what, if it's a cash crop or just something else, to provide direct benefit to the cash crop. So before we had Roundup Ready alfalfa, the main way to establish it was with a companion crop. A lot of times it would be oats. A lot of times producers would either cut this with hay. Of course, this is a lower seeding rate than you would for an oat grain crop, or so they would still harvest it for grain, sometimes raise the combine a little higher. That's a companion crop. Another one for gardenings, if you don't know what this plant is, it's borage. A lot of people plant it to draw in pollinators and other beneficial insects. Never really believed it until my wife did a couple of years ago, and I cannot believe how many bees actually came in. Same thing with marigolds, bringing in beneficial insects while keeping out some of the pests. Same thing. We're not actually getting any economic value out of these crops, but they're bringing in and trying to help benefit, the garden, what is our cash crop. And the last one, fallow, that's kind of an old term. People still do it. I still kind of see that. A lot of people say, well, I'm resting the soil. That's kind of an old term. Basically, you would plow that area up and left it unsown. Just plow it up, let it rest to help moisture and sometimes fertility. That's kind of an old school of doing it. And truthfully, I don't know how good it actually does. I think you can run into bigger issues with that. So why cover crops? Basically all the benefits we break down to two different things. One, they're going to improve profitability of the operation in a lot of different ways. One, will reduce fertilizer cost, and we'll talk a little bit about that. At the same time, they can minimize weed and other pests, depending on how you're terminating that crop or ending it. Sometimes you get really good weed control just from the suppression and leaving that mulch on the top of the surface. Can help, especially in large scale settings, help keep the weeds out. Same thing with pests. A lot of times, some of the brassicas, like the turnips or radishes, those are really good for nematode control, some insect control, because some of the chemicals, when they break down, they are actually toxic to those. Conserve moisture. Anytime we have a cover on there, we're going to have more moisture, and also increased yields. I think just having those on, we have a lot of trouble with trying to develop what the economic benefit of cover crops are. We know the increased yield, but some of these other benefits we really don't know. Of course, depending on your operation, it's a great way to really kind of help diversify the income. If you have livestock, they're a great source for grazing to help extend the grazing season. And it really does help the cover crop too, because it does promote more growth. Or hay is a little bit more tricky because you're taking a lot of nutrients off, but it is a potential good source of income for that operation. On the other side of that, they're also very good for improving soil health. And we'll talk a little bit about these. I didn't want to go too in much. I want to kind of keep it more of the nuts and bolts. I'm always willing to answer any kind of questions for soil health and environmental quality. One, of course, instead of leaving that ground bare or just crop residues, we put a cover on there, minimizes erosion. And of course, you can see if it's on the slope, there's always a chance that there's that movement of that water off the surface, especially some of these rains we've had the last month or so, washing that off the surface. You can see this is an old cartoon, I think, from the NRCS when it got started, basically just rolling that topsoil off. Soil is a non-renewable resource, and so we want to conserve as much as we can of it. That subsoil, it doesn't, it's not right for growing crops. It's low in fertility. May hold moisture, but too much moisture, most of that rooting depth is right there in that topsoil. So you want to conserve as much as that's possible. And not just from the movement of water, but a lot of times just the impact of that raindrop actually breaks up those soil particles, those soil beds. So you can see here that rain splashing actually breaks those up, which that helps, facilitate the movement off site, but it also develops this real crust. And I'm sure everybody's probably seen that from time to time. The impact breaks those up and it clogs the pores. And so what happens is when it dries, you get this almost rough cement-like surface, and water can't move into it. And, and of course, if we have that cover, we only prevent that, but we also have roots growing. Those roots growing do a lot of different things. One is actually make root channels. I mean, we'll talk about some of the different types here in just a second, but actually the pushing of that root through the soil actually makes a lot of channels to help that water infiltration. And when they break up, they actually help glue it up. And I think you're going to hear a lot more about the soil health aspect. I mean, we're right now still at the tip of the iceberg. I was talking to a colleague last week before, when we were in school, we always was taught that, soil was kind of this inert resource. It was there for fertility, yada, yada. Now we're starting to realize that it's actually kind of a living organism that's on no ecosystem. So I think, we're going to hear more and more about soil health and the importance of it, and mainly these two factors, the organic matter and soil carbon. And I won't get a whole lot into that. I didn't want to get into really dive deep into the science of that. But anytime you improve organic matter, soil carbon, it's going to be in your benefit. Soil carbon is actually the breakdown. So organic matter is just any kind of plant material. When that breaks down, decomposes, at its most decomposed state, it actually acts like a glue. It helps hold all those soil particles together. And that makes just tons of benefits. So, erosion, I showed you those soil particles breaking up, moving that crust. Having the higher soil carbon helps those, they call it aggregate stability. They're more resistant to breaking up. They're more resistant to soil compaction, driving over it, grazing it, trampling down. It's more resistant to that. From the organic matter, it's like a sponge, so to speak. The more you have, the more you're holding the more moisture throughout the year, especially in the drought. In a normal year, you might not see a difference, but if you talk to a lot of these cover crop guys, you can really tell a difference in the dry year. If anybody ever makes it to Mason County in the summer, please look me up. I have a great example. We've done field days out there. We have the same soil type on one side of the road. I have a producer. He's been in no-till and for, I think, 20, 30 years, and then cover crop for probably another 15, 20. On the other side of the road, we have just conventional tillage with no cover crop. And it's amazing just how different there's it. They're just, take a shovel full and it's just so full of life. On the cover crop, no-till side, you'll see earthworms, you'll see a lot of different roots, you'll see a lot of fungus, hyphae, mycorrhizae off those. On the other side, you just get this big clump of dirt, big shovelful. So we're starting to realize there's a lot more benefit to that. And I think if we ever figure out a way to put a dollar sign to that, how much it's actually worth, I think we'll have a lot more people including cover crops. And also too, pollinators. So pollinators, yeah.
Could you explain what you're saying when you say no-till? Because a lot of the folks have not heard.
Okay, so with no-till, and that's where I'm kind of going back to my agronomics. So, and in terms of like field crops, instead of actually tilling that ground up and then seeding it, they'll actually do a no-till, which is basically you're not stirring it, you're not going through and plowing it first, you're just planting directly into that soil. Sorry about that. And with gardens, there's some people messing around with that. And anytime you till that soil up, you're going to burn organic matter, soil carbon, because it's kind of like stirring a compost heap. Every time you stir it up, those microbes are getting more air. They're going to burn a little bit off. But there are people fooling around a little bit with no-till and, garden and horticulture crop situations. So that good, Lisa?
Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
So, and then the other side too is, they provide a chance for pollinators. Pollinators become a kind of a new interest of mine. The more I learn about, the more fascinating they are. Having these cover crops, I don't think we realize the impact they have on pollinators, not just from a nesting habitat, but also from a pollen source in the early spring or late summer or late fall, and even summertime if you're using the summertime crop. So there is a lot of potential for that. Talk about ecosystems. So before we get a little bit, talk about what are types of cover crops. We'll talk more about this when I talk about species selection. But I broke them down to kind of the 4 different types. First is your grasses. Those are your cereals, rye, wheat, triticale, oats. Ryegrass is a big one. Those are all kind of cool seasons. You plant in the fall, and terminate in early spring. We do have a lot of summer ones that we use for cover crops. You don't see as much of those. Sudan grass, sorghum, Sudan crosses, teff, millet. Those are all really good productive soils good productive crops in the summertime if your operation does that. We'll talk about some of the disadvantage of that. But the nice thing about grass is, from a cover crop, they provide a lot of things. They're usually one of the quickest things to come up. They grow fast, they spread. So you can see, each individual plant right here is just one part of the plant, tillers. The more you have of those, the more protection you're going to get from that soil surface. And so the nice thing about those cereals and most of the others, they really spread out. And you get one old plant start and they just kind of bush up, so to speak. And the other side of that too is you look at that root system. They have a fibrous root system, which you can see kind of here they come, if I'm a pointer, they branch out. You don't really see one root. They kind of really explore and go every which way. And that's really important for many different ways. There's root channels, there's more there. We'll talk about nutrient capture in a little bit. They do a really good job of exploring that whole soil, and not only that, anchoring it together so it can't erode. So that's kind of the benefit from grass. Is a legume. Most people know what a legume is. There's your clovers, vetches, peas, cowpeas, medics. Clovers and vetches are probably more common ones for cover crops. Winter pea, I'll let you know my true feelings about peas here in a little bit. Those are all cool season. Some of the good warm seasons, cowpeas are a really good one. Medic, maybe you've probably seen like yellow medic. It's kind of almost looks like alfalfa with a yellow bloom on it. Sweet clovers, some of the common lespedizes are really good. The nice thing about those is they have that, instead of having a nice fibrous root system, they got these long tap roots, and they basically help push the way through that soil. They can really help compaction. They kind of grow through and kind of push that soil, make these real deep long channels for water to infiltrate. But also too, is that if you actually look, they have these nodules, and these may be crimson clover, but they're probably soybean as big as they are. But if you pull up, white clover plant, you can look and you'll see these right here. If you were to slice it open, it actually looks about like that. It looks real, your dark red. If it's doing good, it's going to be like a light pink to a dark red. That's actually the rhizobia. So legumes actually fix nitrogen. I'm sure many of you heard. They form that relationship with the bacteria, and they actually grow within those little bumps on the root there, those nodules. And so that's the really good thing they add to soil. I kind of think we overestimate how much nitrogen they provide, and it's a little bit tricky of a relationship, but they do provide some. And if you are using this for, large scale, a little bit larger scale, they are really good for forage nutrient value. The third type is brassica. Those are kind of like your mustards, radishes, canola, turnip, even kale and arugula. You're starting to see more of those kind of incorporated in those. Those are kind of late crops, overwinter crops. The nice thing about those, they have really large extension, especially the turnips. So this is actually a daikon radish that probably, I don't know, 5 years ago, everybody was wanting to plant those in there, and they're still really good. They call them biodrilling. So you think about a legume taproot on like clover's probably only be 6 to 8 inches. These are just massive, and they basically grow down through there. And you're looking at sometimes a foot, sometimes 18 inches deep. So they really are really good for breaking up soil compaction, or if you have a pan layer, like a hard layer under the soil, those are really good for breaking those up. They provide a lot more growth kind of that late fall, early spring. mainly at late fall. A lot of them do winter kill. And the other side of those, I called it phytochemicals, for lack of a better word, but basically plant derived chemicals that have some benefit. They're really good for pests. These break down and they kill a lot of, I know nematodes is a big one. They can actually suppress some weed species, seeds of weed species. So they're another good one to kind of crop, and you can eat them too. I know Lisa, we were talking about turnips. A lot of people plan to eat, so they are good to eat. Even this daikon radish, a lot of people grow them and will eat them too. And then you kind of have some miscellaneous ones. I call them specialty crops because a lot of times they do have potential, but a lot of times there's a certain situation or a certain scenario you're going to put them in. Like one is buckwheat. If you've ever seen buckwheat, it's if you all ever go to Preston County in late September, October, they had the buckwheat festival. So it is a potential food source, but it's very quick growing. It's a summer one. Sun hemp is another summer one that's kind of been thrown around. It's really big nitrogen fixture, but the really short season crops. Phacelia, I haven't grown Phacelia. I know a little bit about it. It's kind of a unique plant, good for pollinators. For the most part, I think we don't see a whole lot of those. But there are always kind of some oddballs with that. So real quick, kind of talk about fertility, the impact of that. Really a cover crop is going to improve soil fertility. And a lot of times when we think about cover crops, that's what we're thinking about. We're going to try to get some kind of, most people think about erosion or they think about kind of improving their fertility needs. And one is nitrogen fixation. I call it biological nitrogen fixation. Of course, those are your legumes. And, looking through the literature and some of the numbers, you can see some of the burst seam clover, you can grow around here, does winter kill. On average, you're looking at probably 80 to 120 pounds of nitrogen in theory. But you can, hairy vetch is a good one. It's not quite as big a nitrogen fixture as some of the others, but it does provide a little. But, when I talk about nitrogen fixation, I always hate getting questions about how much it's going to fix because you can look at this range, like here at Bernstein clover, anywhere from 50 to 280 pounds. Crimson clover, anywhere from 70 to 240. I mean, it's just such a very sensitive process. You have to, you got to have the right plant, you got to have the right bacteria, you got to have all the environmental conditions good. So it's a very sensitive process. So even though we say we can get that much, a lot of times it's a lot less. And I think a lot of times we kind of overestimate that from it depends on a lot of basically the growing window for those. And a lot of times in a cover crop situation, most of these studies are based on a whole growing season. In a cover crop system, you're only looking at maybe a half to a quarter between when you plant it, when it goes dormant, and then when it kind of greens up in the spring versus when you're going to terminate that crop. Now, a good rule of thumb is bigger the plant, the more nitrogen it's going to fix. And I'll talk a little bit about how to maximize that. But one thing kind of sure you do max, yep.
Sorry, if you do have a big operation, it can save you some pocket change to
it does
invest in a good cover crop.
Yeah, it does add up. One thing to ensure if you are going to get fixed a lot of nitrogen from that is one that is to inoculate it, which is basically just adding that bacteria to that, but it's very specific. In a pasture situation or a hay situation, you may or may not have to inoculate because if that type of plant, like if we've had red clover in that field before, we probably don't have to inoculate because that bacteria is already there. But if this is something new you're bringing in, you're going to make sure you have to inoculate. Make sure that way you're getting the right bacteria with the right plant to form those nodules to get nitrogen fixation. And even if let's say if you've had, crimson clover there before, it's just cheap insurance to go ahead and inoculate it again. Most seed anymore is pre-inoculated. It's always good to ask if you're not sure, but that's a good way. But just to show you, it's very specific. There's different groups. So like sweet clover and alfalfa medic all take the same type of inoculum. sunhip and cowpea are in one group. Your peas, your vetches are going to be in one, and your clovers. And clovers is a little bit unique because clovers actually has subgroups. So what that means is, the inoculum you would use for like a red and white clover is not going to be the same one that you would do like a crimson or bursting clover. And I actually believe that crimson and some of the other clovers actually have separate subgroups. So if you're buying the seed, make sure it is pre-inoculated. If it is, most times they're okay. If they're going to use the right one that's coming from a vendor. If it's just straight seed, make sure you're getting the right one. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me or call your local agent. I know Evan is a great guy, and he would be able to help steer you in the right direction. So besides nitrogen fixation, I really think we get more of our nutrient benefit just from nutrient capture. And basically during those winter and early spring months, I really think that's probably where we get our most benefit and most nitrogen collected from. What that is, if you look at, sorry, my computer, if this is kind of ballpark graph on what nitrogen mineralization looks like in your soil throughout the year. What nitrogen mineralization is basically just the nitrogen released from that soil organic matter. That plant material, that breakdown throughout the year, how much is actually getting released. Of course, when temperatures get warmer, it's going to increase. And when they get colder, they're going to decrease. And there's always these daily fluctuations, which is just temperature of the day. But a lot of times, a lot of people don't really think is that we're actually getting a lot, or at least getting some of that mineralization in that late fall and winter period. If you think about how our winters are compared to, northern Minnesota, they get cold and they stay cold. And I would say it's kind of just being, a lot of those soils freeze and they don't come out and they don't unfreeze till spring. Here we get so much warm weather. I mean, we've had 60, 70-degree days the last 5 years in December. And so what that means is a lot of that nitrogen is still kind of being released. And in other words, it's becoming more plant available. And what a cover crop does is actually having some kind of an active root system there helps suck up those nutrients before they actually go to waste. So if this nitrogen is actually getting released, broken down, become plant available, if it's bare, a lot of times it's going to leach below that root zone, or it's going to be lost somehow. And so basically that's money lost. And so having not just a root system there, but something that's actually taking up nutrients helps capture that. And I always the best way I've ever heard it explained, it's kind of like a leaky balloon. In the wintertime, we have that slow leak of nitrogen. Whereas, some of the Midwest soils, they get cold and they thaw and you get this flush of nitrogen. We kind of have that slow leak throughout the late winter. And so having that there really does have a benefit. Grasses are primarily going to be your main contributor to that because of that fibrous root system. Sometimes you'll call it nitrogen scavenging, or some people will call it in some of these cover crop talks or gurus will call it nitrogen scavenging, but it really applies to a lot of other stuff, especially phosphorus. Grasses are probably the most dominant one because of that root system, but all species contribute to that to some extent, just having a root in their system there. But if you actually look at how much nitrogen that grasses provide, it depends on the crop, obviously, in the year, but you're looking at 30 to 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre on a per acre basis. The price of nitrogen, I think is, make the math easy, it's pretty close to about 50 cents a pound. So, I mean, there's $15 to almost $50 an acre, and that really adds up, like Lisa pointed out. So having those there, it's a really good way to do that. How much is actually provided, depends on a lot of several factors, the timing of the seeding. And I really think, well, one, having that crop in early enough, and there's a catch-22 with that, having enough time to develop a good root system to capture those nutrients and capture as much as possible. And then from the legume side, that symbiosis that forms with that bacteria takes anywhere probably about 6 to 8 weeks most time. And there are some cases it might be a little bit quicker. But you're looking at a long period from when you put that down till it actually fixes nitrogen. The more time you give it before a killing frost or when it comes dormant, you're going to have more nitrogen fixed. So give it plenty of time to actually go through that process. On the other side of that is when you're going to terminate that cover crop, when you're going to kill it. The later in the season you go, you're going to get more of that nitrogen captured and more of that nitrogen fixed. But you don't want to go too late where you're going to start interfering with your cash crop. So, I mean, cover crops are all about just kind of complementing those cash crops you never want to take away from them. So that's a big one. And another one, I won't get too much of the science other than C to N ratios. You know, C to N is C is carbon, nitrogen is N. And basically that balance determines a lot of that fertility. And I promise this will be probably the most science I really get into. I'll try to keep it.
Here you go again with your math and your.
What's that,
Just
Lisa?
kidding. I said, here we go again with math and science.
Well,
I
try
wasn't
to
too
keep
great at
minimized,
either.
It's an important concept, but basically it's just the amount of nitrogen or carbon you have in relation to how much nitrogen, and it basically determines how much nutrients going to be available for that cash crop, and also, you know, how much organic matter you're going to be adding to that soil, or you're going to use some up potentially. And why is it's carbon and nitrogen is because it all has to do with those microbes. You know, there's microbes in the soil that, you know, the soil biology, that living part of it, you know, they have to get their fill. They do a lot of good for us, but we got to make sure we're feeding them, so to speak. You know, a lot of times an ideal ratio for a good mixture is about 24-1. So we want about 24 parts of carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. At that point, everything's kind of like almost an equilibrium. And if we get too much above that, what happens is that cover crop, when we kill it or terminate it, a lot of times you're going to get slower decomposition of those residues. Those microbes are nitrogen starved at that point. And so it's going to take a lot longer to break those down, which may, depending on what the ratio is, may not be a bad thing. But a lot of times, if there's not enough nitrogen there in that cover crop to break down, they're actually going to take nitrogen out of the soil. So not only are you not getting that nitrogen from that plant material, you're actually taking nitrogen from the soil that was already plant available, and microbes are using it to help break that down. So you're kind of robbing yourself. And what you get is kind of this short-term nitrogen deficiency. And you can see, if you look in here, this is probably, I don't know what crop this is. It's probably, actually looks kind of like ryegrass. But a lot of times rye is really bad about that because you get so tall and stemmy when people terminate it. There's not a lot of nitrogen. And so it's robbing that nitrogen from the soil to break it down. And if you look how yellow these corn plants look, you basically have a nitrogen deficiency. And I put temporary in quotation marks because you will get that nitrogen back eventually. Eventually it will be released back into the soil. It may be late in the year and it may be next year, but you eventually get it back. But in that meantime, you know, that's already been stunted. That may or may not have helped decrease yield just from having that, you know, that little bit temporary deficiency. And so you may have to actually more nitrogen fertilizer to that to help maintain those yields. On the downside of that, if you're much lower than that, you get a very quick decomposition, which means you're going to get a lot more nitrogen released quickly, which sounds like a good thing, but that residue is going to break down. So if you're relying on that for weed control, having the actual cover crop they're laying in your rows, it's going to be less because it's going to break down. You may have more weeds throughout the year, especially in that later season. You know, if you're going to get a slower increase in buildup in that soil organic matter and soil carbon, if you can get some. I've seen cases where you're actually having too low of a ratio. You're actually burning off some of that soil carbon because at this point you're nitrogen rich, you're a little bit carbon starved. You know, that's what those sugars, that's what those microbes need when they're living there. So they're actually robbing that out of your organic matter and soil carbon. So really, in some way, you're almost burning that a little bit too much. You know, and the other side of that, you know, you get a quick release, but it's too fast and the crop can't keep up with it, and there's potential for loss. So Lisa, am I okay on the science? Did I explain that at a low enough level, or did I?
That makes complete sense, total sense.
Okay, you're my gauge since you're the only person talking. So, you know, and I'm
know me, I'm not a big expert, so I'm good.
Okay. I I'm a person, I think visually. And so just kind of put it in this, if you look at nitrogen availability, if you have a low CDN ratio, this is just concept. So I don't know a number for this. Basically, you're going to have something like this. You're going to get this mineralization, and then by midsummer, there's going to be not much nitrogen available. It's already kind of mineralized. High CDN ratio, it's a much slower rate of availability, but it's over a longer period. And so, I mean, that's a good thing, but think about the breakdown of that nitrogen from that cover crop. That's kind of a slow release nitrogen. You want it to kind of miter out at a rate that the crop's going to take it up. And so, in theory, you may get the same, you'll get the same amount of nitrogen no matter what. It's just the fact of when you're actually going to get it. And so if you look at corn uptake, I mean, this is field corn, but it translates over to sweet corn, same thing. And just about any crop is you got this slow rate of uptake of nitrogen. And when it's very small, vegetative, and it gets close to flowering, it's going to really increase it. And toward maturity, it plateaus off. If we have that low CDN ratio, what happens is we got all this breakdown here, which you had a lot of availability early, but the uptake was low. And so what happens is that nitrogen either it may be there, may not. It may have leached, it may have volatilized, which is going to gas form, depending, a lot of ammonia fertilizers will turn into gas and get into the atmosphere. Chances are the weeds could have took it up or something else we didn't want it to. Like I say, it could have leached, it could have went down towards groundwater if it was nitrate based. So we had a little bit too much breakdown. It's not plant available, but it was when the cash crop wasn't taking much of it up. On the other side, if we have, that high CDN ratio, you can see it kind of matches up a little bit better over here towards the spring. It's not at least a dramatic one, but you get over here when that crop is really starting to need it about summertime, close to flowering, close to producing whatever, fruit, whatever it is, you can see that we're going to be more limiting. Now we're hitting that nitrogen efficiency later in the season, and honestly, that's going to be more critical for your yield. So it's really kind of about balancing those two, and that's where kind of that 24-to-1 is. At that ratio, it's a good balance between feeding the microbes and they're kind of metering that nitrogen. And I use nitrogen as an example, but other nutrients too, especially phosphorus, is a lot of it's organic based, at kind of a more efficient uptake or efficient rate that matches the uptake of the crop. And just kind of show you some numbers on this. These are some common C/N ratios of various materials. Sawdust, 250-to-1. If the ideal number is 24-to-1, that's 10 times way more carbon. People still add sawdust to their garden areas. I have no idea why. To me, that's one of the worst things you can do. Yeah, it adds carbon to it, but you're robbing a lot of nitrogen that you won't get back for a long term. Corn stalks, residue, 60-to-1. And if you kind of look at, a cereal rye, a cover crop, when it's vegetative, when it really hasn't put that stem and seed head out, it's about 14-to-1. But the thing about rye, it comes on so quick and so early in the season. When you're looking at when it's kind of headed out and producing those grains on it, you're down to 40-to-1. So it's a little bit tricky to balance. Crimson clover, you can say 15-to-1. A high nitrogen, it fixes their nitrogen, so it's going to be a little bit lower. You look at some of the others, hairy vetch, red clover, ranges from 10-to-1. Same thing with your brassicas, your canola, your turnips, your radishes, about 10 to 25-to-1. The thing I noticed that it depends a lot on the species and also the maturity, or in other words, termination date. And a lot of times when we talk about, not to get too much into science of it, it's kind of about balancing those two. Most times that rye, when they terminate that crop or kill it, it's actually already probably headed out or pretty close to that, a pretty high CDN ratio. But we balance that by providing nitrogen with like a crimson clover. So it's about kind of balancing that mixture a little bit. And brings me to kind of selecting cover crop species. Cover crop species, forage species, I always had this analogy. I'm a part-time carpenter, or at least I think I am. The species you have are kind of like tools in your toolbox. None is better than the other. Rye is really good in some situations. Wheat may be better in other situations. None is better than the other. Some tools are better suited for a job than another, right? My dad, I learned everything I know about carpentry from him. He can take a circular saw and a square, and he can build you an arc. Maybe I need a little bit more tools than that. But basically, the more tools you have, the better. Some are going to be better suited. I can drive a nail with a crescent wrench. I've done it, but it's a lot more efficient with the hammer. The lack of diversity in your tools limits what you can do with them. Same thing with cover crops. I'll talk about diversity in just a second. The more you have, the more things it's going to do. In the wrong hands, some tools can be dangerous, and not dangerous where it's actually going to be a detriment to the cash crop. But, there could be cases where if these cover crops are misused, they may come back as a weed later on. Ryegrass is a good example of that, and buckwheat potentially. But a mixture of cover crops is always going to be your best bet. The more diverse, the better. And I always say within economic reason. If you start reading about some of these cover crop gurus, they'll have like this ungodly number of species in there. And I think it is true. The more you have, the better. But within your price limitation, we got to be realistic with that. I think a good rule of thumb is try to get at least minimum of one species from those three types. Try to have one grass species, one legume, one brassica. And that way they all do different things I kind of talked about. And that way you're balancing, at least trying to get one of everything. I was telling Lisa, like I had seeded some in my garden last week, or actually just the other day and the week before. And I just do usually wheat and crimson clover. Just try to keep it simple. I probably should have thrown turnips in. I had turnip seed, but I don't know why I didn't. That way you're getting some benefit for that. If the more the better, again. So if you can incorporate more of those into though, I think you're better off. But it can be expensive, especially some of these specialty cover crops. The seed can be very expensive. I meant to include like an appropriate balance. I would say probably if you're about 50 to 60% grass, it'd probably be better off. Try to keep it 25 to 30-ish% legume. And probably the rest of that being some kind of brassica. That way it gives you a really good mixture. I think those grasses are kind of the workhorse of the cover crops, and those other ones really complement that. But again, it depends a lot on your operation too. And if all else fails, one grass species of monoculture is better than none. A lot of times we get talked about diversity too much. If you just have a cover crop period, it's going to be in your benefit. If you just throw weed out, that's a lot better than nothing. For all the same, you're still getting some benefit added to that. Some things to think about in selection. What is the goal of the cover crop? What's your goal? What do you want out of that crop? Is it fertility? Is it soil health? Are you mainly doing for weed control, erosion, soil moisture? Think about what's your actual goal, and that'll make sense here in a minute when I show you some of these tools. When do you need that crop? Do you need it mainly as a winter crop, or is your operation where you're going to have a little bit of a lag period, a summer crop? Like my intern, he was planting alfalfa last year, got a little bit too late. He needed something to hold him by until this fall where he could plant it. So I recommended the Sudan grass. That was something that it was a good cover crop to keep that area maintained, keep weeds out, and he was actually able to sell it as a hay crop too. When is that crop going to grow, and how does that work around when you're going to plant and harvest that cover crop? What are some kind of constraints to your operation? What are your soil conditions like? Is there a pH issue there, fertility issue? Some are really good in low fertility, and some, even though they improve fertility, still need a basic level of fertility, drainage, soil depth, climate. Some winter kill real bad. Is your area get a lot of snow cover, or that area get rainfall? And just some of the logistics, how are you going to seed it? Most garden or horticulture situations would probably be limited in what we do. We're going to broadcast it, but on the other end, how are you going to kill it? Think about that. And we'll talk more about this when I talk about those. So real quick, I know we're getting a little bit short on time. I don't want to keep going. So rye, I got my information backwards. Some of the good things about rye, it's a really good scavenger of nutrients in early spring. It's one of those, probably one of the best ones. It will take a lot of nitrogen, a lot of calcium, phosphorus. It will catch that before it's lost. It's very high yielding, which can be good or bad. Very quick growth, comes up really quick, takes off, doesn't really need a whole lot. It still has a moderate level of drought tolerance, tolerant to low fertility, at least compared to the others. Some of the disadvantages, it comes on really quick and it gets mature really early, which sometimes can lead to a high CDN ratio. I mentioned that nitrogen deficiency. In most cases I've seen, it's nearly all been rye because it's such an early maturing crop. You're probably going to see it heading out probably some cases, probably some years, probably late April. It does have, it's not quite flood tolerant, which I don't know if many cover crops actually are. The regrowth, if you don't terminate it right, it can be somewhat aggressive. With vegetable crops, there's a potential for allopathy, which is basically it produces some the roots actually produce some chemicals that will actually suppress seed of not only weed seed but also potentially vegetable seeds. There's a potential for that. Most cases, if you terminate it right, give it about 2 weeks after killing it, most times there's very minimal effect on those. Wheat is another good one. It's a good scavenger. There's nutrients, probably not as great as rye. Does a fairly good job though. Still high yielding, very quick growing. A little bit later maturing than rye, which is why I like it. A lot of times, you don't see it really heading out till May or so, early mid-May. Gives you a little bit more time. Maybe it'll work a little bit better in some systems. The disadvantage, no flooding tolerance at all. Still has a pretty moderate level of fertility. Needs some. I say that, but I have seen it grow in some pretty low soil. It's a little bit lower yielding than rye, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Annual rye is a big one you hear a lot about. It's also a good scavenger, comparable to wheat, maybe a little bit behind wheat. Not quite as high yielding as the others. It has good flooding tolerance because it does have a shallower root system. Less tolerant to drought. I know as a forage, it does okay if a drought. It still has a moderate to high fertility requirement. It can be very aggressive for regrowth. It has a very good potential to become a weed, because it has a lot of tillers and they actually can take off. And I've actually, a lot of my row crop guys, they hate it because it is hard to kill sometimes. And the seed can be a little bit more expensive. Do we have a question or? Okay.
That's what I put in the chat if it's ready to add, to go ahead and type their questions in. But if you've got a question, go ahead and.
Okay, well, if not, Crimson Clover, honestly, it's probably one of my favorite. I know my wife's favorite because it's just she thinks it's really pretty. We always do that just to mainly. I keep my wife happy. But it's a good nitrogen fixture. It does do that. It is fairly high yielding, very quick to germinate. We seeded some, was it 2 weeks ago where we had that Sunday rain. Within 2 days, it was already germinated and taken off. It's a little bit later maturing, kind of matches up really good with wheat in terms of maturity. Does fairly shade tolerant, which could be, and a lot of times you'll see it that's actually just a living mulch and actually grow corn inside of it, and it does tolerate pretty well. It's pretty tolerant to cold conditions. It doesn't winter kill very easily compared to some of these others. The bad thing about those, and especially mainly all these legumes, they require an early fall establishment. Mainly, they need about 6 weeks before a good killing frost to get good and situated so it will survive the year. It does have poor drought and heat tolerance. It doesn't really tolerate those at all. Hairy vetch, same thing, nitrogen fixer, can be high yielding. It's probably one of the most cold tolerant legume species. It's adapted just about anywhere in terms of fertility and soil conditions. It will grow anywhere. It has a very high reseeding potential. I knew the places. I mean, I've seen before we moved here in Kentucky, our hillside would be purple, and the whole holler was purple. No one planted it. It came in and started reseeding itself in these hay fields, and it would just take over, which is the downside of it. It can be, in a gardening system where if you're going to till it, probably not so much, but it can be problematic. It can be slow to establish. It's one of the things, if you want it there, it may not come up. The seed can be a little bit expensive. It does have, even though it produces nitrogen and does tolerate a lot of conditions, it still needs a lot of phosphorus and potassium to maintain a lot of good growth. So maybe fertility wise, winter pea is one you hear about. People talk about it. It's in all the books. I have not really heard a good thing about winter pea. And just an experience. I've tried to grow it, and it some of the good things, does fix your nitrogen. It does grow really quick in cool conditions, and it's just, really it's just like any other pea. You can use it as a feed source. You can actually eat the peas off of it. It's very prone to winter kill. I mean, everybody I have known. I mean, one of my probably best cover crop producers, he planted it, and we looked all over 30 acres and found one pea plant. It's, everywhere I've tried it, it's just winter kills really bad. It doesn't tolerate heat or drought. It's very susceptible to diseases and insects. I wouldn't recommend it unless you just really want pea. Real quick to kind of move this along, radishes. Those are a really good one. Like I said, they're bio drills, I've heard them called, and they get that large, extensive taproot. When it breaks down, that soil carbon, it basically just seeps, get these big channels, and it just really cements those soil particles together. I mean, it's really great for compacted soils. I mean, it really breaks those up. You get a lot of quick growth in the fall. It grows a little bit later in the year than a lot of those other fall crops do. You do have the chance for winter kill. It really depends on the year. If we have a real good hard freeze, it will winter kill. And other times I've seen it go all the way till spring. I've actually seen cases where it actually produced seed and it actually became wheat in other fields. Seed can be expensive. At least a few years ago, I knew daikon radish prices were really really expensive. And there's a lot of hype behind them. They're a lot of good. Turnips do about the same thing. You don't get as deep of a root, but they do a lot of good stuff for that. Still they need a little bit of fertility. You can't grow on one, just old hard clay. It does have a little bit of, doesn't quite have the flood because that large taproot, it doesn't quite tolerate floods and or drought with that matter. Buckwheat's a really cool one. It's a summer crop. I've been mainly talking about some of those winter crops. It's a summer crop. It has a very short growth season, very rapid growth. If you were growing it, it's amazing how quick it grows. It's tolerant to a lot of conditions. I think one of the reasons why they grow in Preston County, because not much else will grow. It tolerates a lot of low fertility. It actually will increase the availability of phosphorus and calcium in the soil, not just from a scavenging standpoint. There's been a lot of work to show that it actually excretes a lot of acids, which make a lot of phosphorus more available to the next crop. So it's not actually going to add phosphorus to it. It just makes it a little bit more available. And you're not going to cut your fertilizer half in rate, but any little bit helps. It's really good for pollinators. I mean, they're really good honey source, especially during that kind of summer period when there's not a lot of other things pollinating. It's a really good source for that. The disadvantage, my poor dad, he wanted something. He was letting the garden just going to have something this summer just to let it grow. I said, well, put some buckwheat in it. And he was one week, he was bragging about how good it grew. He was getting real tall. I said, well, don't let it produce seed, mow it down. Well, he waited about a month or so. He mowed it down finally. It produced seed and it came back. He had brush hog about 3 times because it did just the seed. So don't let it go to seed if it's a cover crop because it will come back. The good thing about it, as soon as you hit a good frost, it's going to die. It has no cold tolerance at all. And it doesn't quite have the biomass to yield. It doesn't, some of these other ones, that's kind of why it's kind of a specialty one. So, and there's tons and tons of cover crop. I didn't want to I try to touch on the main ones. But there's actually a really good lot of selection tools, that lets you kind of put in what you want out of it, your operation. And I'm going to try to go. One is Northeast Cover Crop Council. That's a good one. It's kind of more adapted to all of West Virginia compared to some of the others. Kind of where we're at least in Mason County, I feel like we're probably pretty close enough to Ohio to be counted as a Midwest one. And if you got a second, well, both of these you have to have an idea what your plant hardiness is. And most of West Virginia, unless you get up there in Pocahontas County, is a 6. But if I got time, Lisa, I want to show these because I think those are really, really neat. Can you all see my screen? Nope.
Yeah, that's
okay. I just kind of drag it here.
yes.
Can you see? You can see that, Lisa?
The selection tool.
Yep. And so this is the Northeast.
I can see. Yeah.
And it's you can actually filter this out as much. These are all different possibilities of cover crops. Here we're in zone 6. You can search for a specific one in this one. You can come down here, okay, I just want to look at grasses. It will filter out grasses. If I want to look at some of those miscellaneous crops, see, it only has 3. If we can look at that. So you can see that everything's changed over here. Nope. Did I freeze up?
That's we're stuck on your power. Well, we're stuck on your PowerPoint. All we can see is the selection tools PowerPoint slide. So
all right, let me see if I can. All right, let's see if I can stop sharing. As many times as we've done this, Lisa, or Zoom, I should be able to. I should know how to do it.
We're in year what, 2?
Yeah. So can you all see this now?
It's yes. Now we can.
Okay. So what I was saying, there's 2 different ways you can do on this one. It's so you can filter out. So we're in zone 6, so it basically tells you everything that's kind of adapted, and you can break it out. So you can see I clicked on brassicas. It basically shows me all my options for brassicas. I can do brassicas and grasses. It includes everything. But you can go down through these, you can talk about, I want something that's going to be a 4 out of 5 for drought tolerance. And it shows you what your options are. If I deactivate that, so if I want a 3 for flood tolerance, an average flood tolerance. So it's a really neat tool. I mean, there's different things. There's, how you're going to seed it, the growth, the growing window. It's a really neat tool to go through and figure out what actually works for my operation. And actually, if you go to the species selector side of it, you actually can, type in where you're at. Of course, we're zone 6. Hit next. What's my drainage type? My moderate will drain, very rarely floods. It actually lets you put in that data. It gives you kind of an idea of what the average precipitation is, frost-free days. That's what I was talking about, your goals. What do you really want from that? Is it mainly to prevent erosion? Is it, I want to be able to, have something to graze? Or do I just want to add soil drain matter? So you can actually go in and put, I think it limits you at 3, but you actually put in what are your main priorities for that operation. And it basically gives you your goals. It gives you okay, you can have all these potential ones. And so you can see annual ryegrass, it's a 5 out of 5 for my first goal, which was erosion. And set for all those goals. It kind of tells you when you can plant, when the ideal time is. It's basically going to put extension agents out of the job. But you can actually click on the few details.
This existed. This is so cool.
Yeah, I mean, if you just want to look at that crop, it tells you all this stuff. If it's going to break up plow pan, that hard layer, is it a good social pollinator? No, it isn't. It's a grass, so it isn't. But what type of soils it's adapted to, Man, it tells you how expensive it is relatively, how deep to do it. I mean, it's just this great tool. I feel like you can Google it, or I can send it out to Lisa with I'll send Lisa a copy of the PowerPoint too, and if everybody wants a print copy.
That'd be great.
Real quick, can you see my screen? Let me share it again. And this is the other one. This is the Midwest one. Can you see Midwest cover crop up here, Lisa?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
Yes.
It's basically the same thing. You got to cheat a little bit. So like Gallia County, Ohio is just right across. Literally, I could throw a rock and couldn't hit it, but I could hit a freighter and hit it. But like you put that in, and it's kind of the same thing. You know, what's your goals? I want an erosion fighter. I can add another. I want something that's going to really be a good scavenger. It's going to be a good weed fighter. And then you can actually put in, okay, what's my cash crop? So like if my crop's going to be a cool season vegetable, you know, usually I plant April 16th, which is, you know, probably late, but I'm going to harvest it. You can actually give it the window for your operation. And, you know, say it's a somewhat poorly drained soil, no tile, briefly floods. You may not get anything. But you actually put in your windows so you can see like here is kind of when I'm going to plant. And so it gives you a good idea when, you know, how those match up with your operation. So there's a really neat, I think they're really cool tools. They may be helpful. Lisa, I'm a little bit, do I need to wrap this up quick or?
Well, we usually keep it under an hour. If more you need to tell us, you can go right on.
Real quick, I'll just kind of skim through these. Sorry about that. I get talking about cover crops and I get going and I can't shut up about it. All right, I'm back on the PowerPoint.
Yes, it's coming up. You got, this is really cool. I've not really heard this much about cover crops before, so I've learned a lot tonight. So hopefully everybody else has too.
Well, I apologize for going a little bit over, but you know, like I said before, the main thing, it can't interfere with the cash crop. You're stuck with that window. So when you seed is dependent entirely on that. And that's where those selection tools really help out. They can tell you what's good for that. Typically, with anything, the earlier the better. You know, with a fall or winter crop one, we always say mid-August, but I don't get excited about it until about early September. That we got a little bit more moisture then. You know, that the earlier the better. You're going to get produce more growth to suppress some of those winter annual weeds. That's about time they start, like chickweed and dead nettle. They start coming out, and give it plenty of time to suppress those. Give it enough to actually build up enough carbohydrate reserves so it doesn't winter kill. You know, legumes are going to need about 4 to 8 weeks anyhow for the symbiosis form. You know, just more root growth before that plant goes dormant during that cool period. You know, some of the cereals, rye, wheat, triticale, not so much oats. You can go later. Depends on the year a lot. Sometimes you can go about mid-November, but I would say, you know, you increase your seeding rate, I would say 10 to 15% every month after, or every 3 to 4 weeks after late September. And that's mainly just to kind of help compensate. You're not going to get much growth, so you're trying to get thicker to provide more of that soil. You know, so summer crops, cover crops are just like, you know, like any other summer crop. We need to make sure that the soil temperatures are warm. Most times they're going to range from about 55 degrees to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And most time that's about early mid-May. Seeding methods, you know, we want to make sure we have, no matter what we're doing, good seed to soil contact is the best. We want to make sure that seed is actually getting to the soil, and we make sure that it's getting covered and packed firmly to make sure we get that quick germination. You know, for a gardening situation or, you know, high tunnel or horticulture based system, broadcasting is probably going to be the easiest, most economical. basically prepare that seed bed how you would for the garden, broadcast the seed, and you can broadcast it a lot of different ways. Big enough area, you can get on your 4-wheeler side by side, or get the hand spreader. I still use that. And honestly, for my garden, I've done it by hand. Don't take that much extra time. It's very hard to really screw up in terms of coverage. Break it in. I think that's where, these are chain harrows. Honestly, if I have one, you can see there's actually forks. I will flip it over. Chain link fence works really good too. Just something you're just wanting basically to drag that to cover that seed up a little bit. What I usually use a lot of times in the garden, I just take a leaf rake, but I'll turn it upside down so these forks are actually facing up, and just go back and forth and rake it across. That's usually enough to get a good coverage, and make large scale, field crops. I think they're still probably one of the best ones. With those, if you're doing a big one, intercropping is a big one, which again is just seeding into the standing crop, has a lot of advantages. Takes a lot of planning, mainly when that cash crop is and the shade tolerance. I know with field corn, Penn State has done a lot of work. They actually will recommend seeding ryegrass into it when that corn has about 5 true leaves, so it's really young. And by the time harvest comes around, they got a full stand of cover crop, which they're actually grazing, full stand ready to go. I know down here on mine in the state, a lot of people are doing aerial broadcasts where they're actually putting it on with the plane. Those are a little bit tricky because you want to make sure that seed is actually making it in. I know with soybeans, a lot of good time you want kind of where the leaves are not quite dropping yet. Kind of the same thing with corn. You kind of want a little bit late in the season, but it's a little bit harder to actually get it in. But it can be done. Of course, big ones, drilling is a good option. The older I get, the more I like using a drill. I think you just get these nice rows and you don't really get a good coverage. But of course, depending on the crop, the weather during harvest, after harvest, is probably going to may or may not be too wet. You have to worry about putting the seed too deep. And of course, who has a drill anymore? So, but for hort gardens and hort-based systems, probably broadcast and probably the easiest. How do we do it? We want to make sure we give ourselves at least 2 weeks before planting that cash crop, with some exceptions. And with many of those are kind of row crop situations. We'll actually plant green, drill into it, then kill the cover crop. A lot of organic systems will actually do it the same day, seed, and then terminate it the same day. Most grasses, I would say about 18 inches tall. Make sure when you're terminating, make sure that grasses are about 18 inches tall. That gives you enough stem to make sure that your seed to end ratio is not too low. Excuse me. And then make sure you terminate everything before it produces seed. We don't want seed. That gives it the risk of at least, a lot of situations becoming a weed. Something to think about is the biomass, and keep an eye on how much growth you have. It can be a tool or it can be an obstacle. You got to think about how you're going to deal with that to seed your crop. I'll show you some of these methods. It can be a real good tool and asset to actually suppress weeds. But if your plan is to incorporate it, it's really hard to incorporate 4 to 5 tons of plant material with even just a tiller on the back of a tractor tiller. So you need to think about that in terms of, okay, I need to take advantage of this soon, get something rid of that. For a good weed control, you need about 8,000, basically 4 to 5 tons of dry matter surface to actually for optimal weed control. And that's mainly from a field crop situation, but it's very similar to a cover crop or a garden crop. So that's a lot of tonnage. If my goal was to till it, there's no way you're going to get that, or think about how you're going to do that. Some of the methods, and I'll kind of skim through these. Mowing's a good one. Incorporation, tilling it in's another one. Lisa, what do you got above your head? I just know. Oh, it's a cat. I thought it looked like a koala for a second, or a raccoon.
It's Dan, the cat, Lieutenant Dan.
Lieutenant Dan
from Forrest
Gump.
Yeah, it's Lieutenant.
Yeah. Herbicides.
Forrest ran away.
Oh, herbicides are still an option. I know, a lot, for at least for our garden crop, people may not want to do that in rolling and crimping. With mowing, I think it's especially if you have a grass or a cereal, you want to make sure that it's begun reproductive growth before you know it. What that does, it just makes sure those growing points are high enough, but that mower height that you're actually going to kill that plant. So what if you don't know, you can actually they call it joining. So basically at the early part of the year, that growing point of that wheat or rye or anything is right there at soil surface level. As it matures, you don't have to actually see a seed head yet. It actually pushes its way above ground. So a lot of times you get about the 18 inches, like I talked about, it's far enough when you mow it, it's going to kill it off. Even then, mow it as close as you can. If you have a flail mower, if you're seeing a flail mower, you just basically have these cutters that kind of flop around, they shear it off. They do a more effective job at actually kind of chopping it fine and dropping it than just like a rotary mower like your lawnmower does. If you're a lawnmower, use mowed grass when it's wet, you know how it clumps up. That's something, but you got to use what's available. You can still do it. If you're going to mow it and till it in, make sure you're doing it as soon as possible. Try to get the most benefit out of everything you've got there. With some of those brassicas, turnips, you want to make sure you till those in to get advantage of some of those biochemicals. Match the equipment to your cover crop. If you have that 2 ton of cover crop, you're not going to till it in with a walk behind tiller. Make sure you have something big enough to do it. And even with that, you may take multiple passes with it. Herbicides, most of the cover crops we terminate with Roundup. It's a good broad spectrum. It kills about everything. We may, depending on what we have to add a couple of glufosinate, which is Liberty, 2,4-D and Camba. Liberty, a lot of times we'll add to kill ryegrass because it is aggressive. No matter what, whether we're for herbicides or against, we need to make sure we're good. We use good stewardship, good practices to make sure we get a good kill and minimize offsite. Don't spray minimum wind. We want low spray pressure, so we get bigger droplets. They're not going to carry it off. And a lot of times these are systemic, so just getting a big drop on there is enough to kill it. That moves through the plant and kills it. Lower that boom height, usually no more than 2 foot above the canopy. A little bit 18 inches to 2 foot, usually good. A surfactant, which helps it stick and actually get absorbed. Temperature and stage of growth has a lot to do on effectiveness. If we're going to spray it, most time we're going to spray it kind of about that early flowering, shoot for. Temperature makes a big part of that. If we're using Roundup, we need about 55-degree days or higher and about 4 degrees at night to get a good kill. With Liberty, we got to have higher temperatures. We use about 80 degrees to get a good kill with it. So we have to take that in consideration. On the other side, we get too hot, 2,4-D, depending on the chemistry of it. Actually, you get too hot, it will actually volatilize and move off site. So we have to pay attention to that. And I'll finish up with roller and crimping. I know a little bit over, but I think this is it's kind of a newer thing. A lot of people are using it. It's basically what you're doing is just making a layer, just rolling it over. And you can use just a regular round roller. It doesn't work as good, but you see this actually drives over and actually bends those over and breaks them. And you get this nice layer of mulch. It lays it down. What we're actually doing, we're actually, breaking the vasculature. Basically, how that plant transports water and nutrients. You're basically breaking it off, but you're still leaving that plant intact. It's basically like if you're like trying to use a straw and someone pinches it, that's basically what we're trying to do. But we don't actually want to cut it off from the root because then it's a little bit harder to plant into. It's a little bit tricky to do. You really have to have a mature crop when you do that. With most grasses and cereals, we want to be shedding pollen or a little bit later because that stem is brittle enough to get that at that point. If it's really hard to do a brassica or a legume crop. I know with legumes you need about full flower, at least 80% flower, to get a good break on that. If you get a little bit too early, what's going to happen is it's going to look good for about a day, and that crop's eventually going to stand back up. Which at that point it can compete with the cash crop. A lot of times, at least at on a field crop level, this is kind of the organic producer's bread and butter. That's kind of about one of their best, because then you get that nice layer of mulch that keeps a lot of those weeds out. But more conventional guys are starting to use it with herbicides just because you get that lot of good weed suppression with that. So real quick, disadvantages, there's always some potential drawbacks with it. Get more time requirement, when usually at that hard time, you're usually busy, everything else you don't have to do with that. It's always, and it's a disadvantage. A lot of times I think it's a little bit of an excuse. You have additional costs for seeding, terminating, your time in it, investment in it. There's always potential for allelopathy, which is, that there's chemicals from that cover crop doing something. Those are easily managed. Usually if you kill it 2 weeks, give it a week or two before you seed into it, minimal issues. Because you have that cover in the spring, if it's wet, you get a little bit higher. Obviously, they don't dry out as quick, and it stays a little bit cooler. I would say you would get it, it's more of an advantage later in the year. If you plant a little bit later, it'll still be warm enough, but you're still conserving a little bit of moisture. In some areas, those crops will actually wick out a lot of moisture. More dry areas, not so much around here. Because that high moisture, low temperatures, you do have the potential for greater risk of disease. Those are I say yes and no. I mean, it can have some diseases, probably not nearly as, not very much. Especially if you're looking at tomatoes following a cover crop, there's not a lot of similarity in diseases there and pathogens, so probably not as much. Most of those disadvantages are just due to scale of the operation. And I think most of those are potential disadvantages. I think a lot of the benefits outweigh those potential ones, the risk of those. The hard thing with cover crops is like a lot of the benefits I initially mentioned, like the soil organic matter, soil carbon, how that improves everything in the soil. We really don't have a good number value put on that. If we could, I think it'd be a no-brainer. But I think all those are potential disadvantages. They're not going to happen every operation. I think the fear of them out is causing more issue than the actual them being a disadvantage. So my suggestion, if you don't do cover crops, start small. It's human nature when we talk about making a change. We picture this big, massive across the board change. Just start. If you have a couple different gardens or a couple different fields, start with one. Start with, you said, one cover crop species is better than none. Start small. Hey, did that help? Think about it. Was it worth the time? And I think most people will probably do that. So I'm a little bit over on time, not too bad, 15 minutes, but, I'm happy to answer any questions. This is my contact. Feel free, if I can do anything to help out or questions, I'm always here. This is the Mason office. I'm actually splitting between Putnam, but my cell phone is listed there. My email's there. So with that, I thank you all. If you have any questions or, if you want to talk about anything on your operation, I'm more willing to sit and talk about it.
Anybody have any questions for Ben or comments? Has anybody got cover crops on their gardens? I think I know one person on the call who said they might have already done that. The Aggins family said that it was very informative. So we've got a lot of positive feedback coming in. So anybody want to share any cover crop information that you utilize at your place? All right. Well, Ben, thank you so much for
no problem. Thank you all.
Enlightening us with all this knowledge. We thank you so much. Hopefully you can do another one for us next year. Hopefully we get the grant again next year. Well, that's the plan. So we've applied. Hopefully for Appalachia, give us back again.
I'm willing to come down without a grant too, wherever y'all need. Y'all have a good one. I'll talk to y'all.
All right. Thank you, Ben. Bye-bye. Everybody, thank you so much for a great time. We'll hope to see you here in the next couple of weeks. Maybe we can get together face to face. Everybody have a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for attending tonight's meeting. See you soon.